Welcome to the Energion's Tuesday night hangouts. My name's Elgin Hushbeck, and I'm going to be your host tonight because Henry is off at a conference, and in fact, he will be our first guest. So, Henry, tell us, what conference are you at, and what are you doing there?
Well, I'm at the annual conference of the Academy of Parish Clergy. The Academy of Parish Clergy is an organization of pastors who are currently in parish ministry, and include some who are retired from, and they meet to encourage one another for education. They set up chapters and what they would call colleague groups to share about ministry. And then once a year they meet somewhere. Every 2 to 3 years they do it in Florida in February, which allows all of the ones who are from Wisconsin, like you are, Elgin, to come down where it's 80 degrees. And so if you want to listen to some talks about theology, we're hearing about Deuteronomy down here from Deanna Thompson, who just wrote a theological commentary on the book, and we're doing it with the air conditioning on.
Well, we're having a bit of a heat wave here in Wisconsin. We are all the way up to, I think, 32 or 33 degrees today. So we're breaking out our shorts and our short sleeves.
Well, I figure another degree or two and y'all will turn on your air conditioning. You don't like it above 32, do you?
Not too much. So you're doing a study on Deuteronomy. What else is going on down there?
Well, we have that. We have one of our Energion authors, Bill Tuck, is teaching on a series on preaching, how to preach. And what I'm doing here is, along with Jody and Jan, who works with us, we're displaying and selling our books. So as an Energion author yourself, and as Steve is an Energion author, y'all should like me to do that.
We both assume you're focusing on our books when you're selling.
Yeah, well, you can go ahead and assume that. I'm going to go ahead and turn around. I do notice, Elgin, I don't know if it ever does. This thing is never showing my picture is coming up when I'm talking. I don't think that's going to hurt anybody, but just so you know the technical side. I'm going to see if I can manage to flip the camera on this thing. If I can manage to flip the camera, I'm going to show you the, hold on here.
Got a flash of it.
No, not yet. That's okay. Let's get this flipped. We'll make you dizzy again here and show. There we are. You're seeing the book table, kind of swinging across through that. One of the interesting things here, I don't think most people realize just how many books we have in the catalog now. We were a little tiny company with just a few books. There's now over 150, and I'm just sliding through the table that was, well, really it's taking up 3 tables to display all of the books, and we really don't have quite all of them up there even at that. And we don't get to see any of Steve's book on stewardship because they all sold, so he can be happy. So let's turn this thing back.
Very impressive, though.
Hold on, let me see. The only thing I can do is I can turn off my audio completely. I don't have any way to turn it up.
Okay. Well, I think we can hear you all right at the moment. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the challenges of being a small Christian publisher. You now have gone to, what, 150 books did you just say?
Yeah, we have 150 books from going on 70 authors.
Congratulations.
I think that gets us away from being a tiny Christian publisher and lets us be a small Christian publisher.
What what kind of challenges have you experienced as being a Christian publisher?
Well, I think that the primary challenge for any small publisher in the Christian market right now is that there's a very great emphasis on consolidating amongst the major publishers. And as they consolidate, you also get to the point where the people who are going to get published are the people who have what we call a platform, uh, which is you have a 10,000 member church, you have a lot of existing audience, and so it's from the monetary point of view, in effect, it's the low-hanging fruit that's being picked by the very large publishers. And as one of my authors commented, who had some books with a major publishers, and I was curious as to why he would submit to a small company, and he said it's because when one of these large companies takes up my book, yes, I know they have more resources, but they tend to ignore the book after it's been released. And so you're fighting that kind of a trend, and I think, I would hold up my author list as evidence. There are a lot of people without 10,000 member churches who have some really good things to say. But the challenge then is getting people to pay attention because you have everything from Christian media to the general attitude of taking the easy road out, which is let's all get the book from the already well-known author, and so whatever they come out with as the latest is what's there. And so it's the big challenge is getting people to is getting the knowledge out, getting people to know that there are folks there, that there are folks here on our authors list who are doing some really serious theological biblical thinking. They're thinking about the mission of the church, and they have something to say. I find once I can get copies of the books from our authors into people's hands, once I can get them to start reading, they're going to keep on. So it's that first step has been the single the great challenge that we have is getting that first step where people say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and look at this guy who isn't one of the top 10 Christian authors and isn't somebody that everybody already knows about.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems at times it's almost a catch-22 is you've got to be a famous author to become a famous author.
Well, it has been a struggle. It has been a struggle for many people, but as we've had, and I've received some emails from various people recently, well, really over the last 5 years, we've had scandals in the way that these materials are produced with ghostwriting, plagiarism, these kinds of things, because Christian publishing is about becomes about being famous.
Yeah. Well, you can
Comes
just
with
look
the
at
name
some
of
of
the
the
person on
major.
the cover.
Yeah, you can look at some of the major authors in, for example, in the fiction world, and some of them have pretty much become franchises where their name is just sort of licensed out to other people to put in big letters on the cover while you know they the other author writes the book. Sometimes even after the big named authors died, you still see books coming out under their name.
And
Henry, I can think of another challenge for you, and that is you can't please everybody.
well, this is quite true, and I think both that challenge and the first one relate to the fundamental thing that got me into Christian publishing, which is how are we going to educate the church? How can we get people to be aware, and to think of these things? Right now, so many Christians can be basically led around by whatever is the latest popular thing, because they haven't gone through and studied for themselves and made up their own mind. And so by publishing a variety of viewpoints, which I believe are important to challenge people with, I think people need to see more than one stream of tradition. When they go to church every week and they hear only what their denomination or only what their tradition stream teaches, they're not in a position to defend what they believe. They're not in a position to evaluate other material. And so that is an important educational goal, but it is also a challenge. And people, Jody once described our business as losing our friends one book at a time, which is probably an overstatement situation, in that it says, but in a way it is, because, and this goes, I've had books that are considered too conservative, I've had books that are considered too liberal, are considered by different people both too conservative and too liberal. I mean, I remember one book that I got complaints from both sides, and there really aren't just two sides either. You have so many different theological issues. One good place to start educating ourselves is that there is not some group of just liberal Christians and conservative Christians. There are a lot of different issues. There's some validity in a liberal and conservative titles, but at the same time, there are many issues. Steve, I'd refer, for example, to you and David Croteau talking about stewardship. David would be considered conservative in the Southern Baptist tradition, and you, Steve, I think you would accept the label progressive in the Disciples of Christ tradition. And yet, getting together on stewardship, you pretty much have nothing to say about each other but amen on that subject.
True enough.
And the division there is different. And so that's one of the things that we need to educate ourselves about, is that it's not all, one set of issues that everybody's talking about.
And if I may, I think the Energion Discussion Network, which is our blog that the authors submit pieces to from time to time, also shows a panoply of points of view and offers the readers opportunities to engage. And so by having that available as a publisher, you're also providing, beyond the books, great ways for people to engage the text and learn from each other.
That's something that we really want to draw people into, and it also illustrates the challenges, because I think when we watch, as you and I watch the numbers on that very carefully, and sometimes some of the material that I feel is most helpful ends up drawing the least readers. That it's material that should be getting people thinking and bringing out the comments, and instead you're met with silence. And that's a challenge, and that's what we're going to work on, that because we have people who are very competently addressing some serious issues.
Yep. Well, in fact, I'll be having one coming out next Wednesday.
So the 1st of March.
Yep. That should get a few people's blood boiling.
Well,
I'm happy to say I haven't read it yet, so
probably a good thing.
Well, as I've pointed out to several people here, there's really two ways that we lose dialogue. We can go to the extreme that says we're going to be so polite that we don't really say anything. So we never want to say anything that anybody can find offensive. But at the same time, that eliminates the whole, that eliminates dialogue, that eliminates the search for truth. Or we can get to the other side where we're so hostile because we differ that we can't seriously discuss the issues. And I think that that's also a challenge, is to say, how can we, Paul's phrase, speak the truth in love, is, and I think I might almost, because I've abused Paul a little bit, but you speak the truth in love of the truth. If you're speaking it because of learning, if you're speaking it because of the value of it, then you also want to speak it in such a way that people are going to hear. And of course, you'll speak it in such a way that says, I'm willing to listen to you if you can, budge me or change my mind on this issue. And all of that is a personal challenge every bit as much. It is also a, in my case, a business challenge, which is to try to bring out books that way.
Well, there's another factor that oftentimes goes into this, which is if you're not confident in your own views or comfortable with learning new things, getting challenged by different points of view can be a very scary experience. And, particularly when you get into the realm of faith, people can feel like their faith is being shaken, and therefore they react in what we should say, not so helpful ways. I don't think that's necessary. I think, having a strong commitment to the truth, at least I try not to care where things come out. I want to be where the truth is, but, that could be a scary experience when you start off on that journey at first to realize everything you think might be wrong, which actually was my case because I started out as an atheist. So.
Well, one of the things that's happening with the church these days is we've transitioned out of faith as trust into faith as belief, and we've turned Christianity into a belief system. Harold Weiss is doing some really good work in this regard to help us return to the notion of faith as trust. So when our faith is based on a belief system, and that belief system is either challenged or maybe even overturned, we lose our faith in the process, which is absolutely not what faith is for.
No. In fact, I've always drawn a big distinction between faith and belief, in the sense that, the analogy I often use is belief is believing that a bridge will hold up if you walk across it. Faith is actually walking across it. And you can believe, you can be a structural engineer, you can do all the calculations, you can be 100% certain that that bridge will support your weight, but unless you step across it and actually put that into action, then you don't have faith.
Well, I'm wondering if I should ask you if you believe in Kierkegaard's leap of faith.
Been a long time since I looked at Kierkegaard in detail.
Just kidding, anyway.
I find, in my own, I find at some point, which is to say, there is evidence. I have reasons that I believe what I believe, and I'm using belief there intentionally. But there are not enough reasons to make me put my trust in God and cross the bridge based solely as a rational decision. There's a difference there between calling a decision irrational and saying that it is not solely a rational decision. There are places that the evidence has taken me that I have. There are places that my experience has taken me. But there is, there is a leap there that says, um, I'm going to put my faith in God, and I think that's part of the process of being ready then to have your beliefs challenged. Is when you truly do have a trust in God, it is easier then to discuss the details. And too many times, I think we have people whose trust is in what they think, and I talk about salvation by works, salvation by faith, and salvation by correct beliefs. And their assurance of salvation is that they have the theology right. But I'm not saying right theology is not there's not a place for the right theology, but in my view, the right theology makes you quit trusting in your own theology, because your theology isn't the trustworthy thing.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a belief within Christians, particularly evangelicals, that that I think quite rightly that Jesus is the way to salvation. But when you start putting that into some concrete terms, like I often put it in terms of, there's no theology test getting into heaven, right? You get in through your relationship with Jesus Christ. That troubles a lot of people, because then they begin to think, well, the theology doesn't matter at all. I mean, there's a relationship between the theology and the belief, but it's not the theology that gets you there. And kind of an interesting question I'll ask in my Bible study classes is, how many people think they're 100% in everything? They're 100% correct in everything they believe. And you know what? I've never had anyone raise their hand and say they were. So we all accept that we can be wrong in certain areas. It's just a matter of where can we be wrong, and what is really the most important.
Yeah, God's grace is sufficient for your ignorance as well as your other failings.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I was going to put in one more thing there. I think that we on this subject is one where we tend to fall into binary thinking. Either theology is absolutely critical and you have to have it right, or theology is completely useless. And that's really not the case. We don't really do that with anything, as you discover, Elgin, when you ask people whether they believe they're 100% right. We live all the time with uncertainties.
Yep.
There's a lot of things that we don't know for sure, but we know them well enough to take the actions that we need to take. The people even who design aircraft or spacecraft or the automobiles that we drive don't always get everything 100% right. But I don't want them to give up on the idea of getting things as right as they can.
Yeah.
And so, this is one of those cases where we tend to either take it all or take nothing. And that's very unfortunate, because there's a lot of ground there for, continuing to learn. Then there's Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, where he says, if you think you know something, you don't know it as you ought to. It's like the second verse, I think, of 1 Corinthians 8, if I remember my reference right.
Yeah. Well, I think it's actually one of the key important verses for me is Romans 14, where Paul is somewhat settling a number of what we could consider doctrinal disputes. And I find it very instructive that as the apostle, he could have settled it. He could have just said, this is the day you worship, this is what you should eat, right? He could have settled all that stuff, and then we wouldn't have to wonder about it. But instead of settling it, he instead said, don't bug each other about it and live together. Somewhat of a paraphrase, but he chose not to use the opportunity to make the divine pronouncement, but instead told people to be concerned about their own views and let others have differing views. And I think that's something we sometimes lose track of, that we want the ability to be in error ourselves, but we don't want to leave anybody else the ability to be in error.
Well, I fall back on the first chapter of Philippians, where Paul discusses the point of knowledge is really not for its own sake, but so that we might be pure and blameless. In other words, the things that we are to know are to help us to do. And the point is the doing, not the knowing. So back in the King James Version days, when phrase was sound doctrine, we understand that today as healthy doctrine. In other words, the knowledge that supports the right kind of life. And sometimes we think that knowledge for its own sake is the point and uncouple it from the doing.
Yeah.
There's an interesting, speaking of Energion Discussion Network, Alan Bevere's article on Monday is in that same direction. So just one back from the first article, Alan was talking about putting into practice. So just to advertise the good reading we have available without buying any books.
Yep. Well, that just about takes up the first half hour, which has been, considering we all have disagreements with each other in certain areas, has been remarkably harmonious. So we'll have to make a change to that and start disagreeing here in a moment. But I'll give you a chance to have for some couple of final words here, Henry, about what you're doing and how are things looking from sunny Florida.
Well, things are looking pretty good. We've been busy today, and so we'll be coming back. We have a number of things that we're going to do, publicizing both books and the discussion network. So I'm looking forward to being back and doing that, putting in that effort. And I do commend EnergionDirect.com and go and take a look at some of the material that we do have. And I've been looking at some really good forthcoming books here. So watch the website and everything for that over the coming week. I am, because I'm holding a tablet up in my hands, I'm going to leave you and Steve to go to it. Over, I think if you've stuck with the same subject we started with, it's an important subject, and the two of you are just really competent to tear it apart from both sides there.
Okay. Well, enjoy Florida, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Okay, thank you for hosting this, Elgin. And
no problem.
Don't forget to tell people about your books, and before you get into that serious argument.
Okay. Well, again, let me transition to the next half hour by introducing myself again. My name's Elgin Hushbeck. I'm an author for Energion, and I have 4 books, 2 on religion, 2 on politics, and suggest that you may check them out. And Steve, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm also an Energion author. I have actually 2 books right now and 2 on the way. The first one is kind of what we're going to be talking about tonight. It's called I'm Right and You're Wrong, Why We Disagree About the Bible and What to Do About It. The other one is the book on stewardship that Henry mentioned earlier. And then I have the second edition of a book that will be coming out soon called Marriage Equality, Why Same-Sex Marriage is Good for the Church and the Nation. And another much smaller book, but larger than the other small books that we have, which is If Your Child is Gay, what every parent of a gay child needs to know in order to survive in a sometimes disorderly world. So those 2 will be coming out probably in the next couple of months.
Okay.
And it also pretty much pegs me as the progressive that Henry was saying I am.
Yes, and that's just one of many, many places we disagree. So, since we had such harmony in the first half hour, let's go to your book, which strangely is something that we both agree on. The book "I'm Right, You're Wrong" is almost a book I could have written. There's very little in it that I disagree with. So, if you're at all interested from whatever your point of view, because I'm pretty conservative and Steve is not very conservative. In fact, he is a progressive. And yet we agree on that book. So it's a really good book that introduces some of the things we need to consider as we approach the Bible and as we begin to address some of the more difficult questions. But that said, we were beginning to touch on this a little bit in the last half hour towards the end, the idea of how do we put our practice into life. You wrote an article on the Energion Discussion Network, about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, about the ability to understand the Bible, and you called it unintelligible. Do you want to kind of give the audience an idea of a summary of what your point of view was there?
Sure. Actually, the word is incomprehensible.
Excuse me. You're right. My mistake.
That's okay. But what I mean by incomprehensible is that the Bible does not come with inherent meaning on the surface. That meaning is produced by the reader in one's own mind. And meaning is imposed on the text. It doesn't just naturally surface for any fool to see. So the differences of interpretations are actually differences in point of view, differences in the lenses that we wear through which we see the text. It's not so much that we disagree about meaning as we disagree about how we derive meaning. Now, if you don't think the Bible is basically incomprehensible, meaning that it's so clear that it should be apparent on its own in its own reading, then why do we have volumes, thousands of different opinions about what a text means? We do because the Bible doesn't explain itself. We have to find a way of imposing upon the Bible a template to make it make sense. And that's why the Bible in itself is incomprehensible until someone makes it comprehensible, but only to themselves.
Okay. Yeah, I that's the summary that I walked away from. I clearly, based on, for the audience, we went back and forth the Energion Discussion Network. Those posts are still out there. You can go back and see them. I strongly disagree with that. I don't see it as such a binary situation where it's either incomprehensible or not, or fully comprehensible. I see it more of as a spectrum. And I believe the Bible is perfectly clear at a very surface level, but as you begin to go down deeper and deeper, and you begin to ask more questions about what does this mean, it becomes more incomprehensible in some sense. Becomes more difficult to understand. I think the real problems come in when if you take the passages and you put them in context and you read them, they are pretty clear for what they say, but the Bible is not a book of systematic theology. It's a book of probably interpretive history at best. And when you start trying to transform it into what does it say, which I believe is very comprehensible, to what is the meaning, and in particular, what is the deeper meaning, and how does it all fit together, that's when a lot of the disagreements begin. I would also say, one real quick final summary, I'd also say, while there's lots of different disagreements, there's also a very large core of agreement between the Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant faiths. And if we stick with that core of agreement, then I think that part of the Bible is very comprehensible. As you start drifting off into other areas, and to give what for me was a great example of, say, prophecy, that's almost completely up for grabs as to exactly what that means.
Well, in the first place, what the Bible says is irrelevant. What the Bible means is the relevance. Now, let's test your hypothesis of the simplicity of some of the Bible by asking you to explain to me, what does God is love mean?
It means God.
Everybody says, God is love.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does that mean?
Well, what does love mean?
Well, that's the point. What does it mean?
If you want to say that all conversation is incomprehensible, then we have a problem with comprehensible. I think love has a particular meaning. It's not a simple thing to define, but when I say to my wife, I love you, she does not take that as an incomprehensible statement. And
that's because she has you in a relationship that you together have agreed on certain understandings. That is not true if you were to say to someone else that you love that you don't have that same relationship with, to be understood in the same way. That's the problem of saying a word like God is love and thinking you know what it means. You don't even know what God means, let alone love. But we invest these words with certain characteristics, some of which has a range that is shared by other people, much of which is not shared by other people. It's kind of like the exercise about God as Father is reprehensible to some people whose fathers abused them. So we can't say that because there's some clear notion stated in the Bible that it's clear to everybody on the same basis.
Well, this is where I go back to the whole concept of a spectrum. To say God is love is comprehensible at a surface level. As you begin to dig deeper and deeper about what does that really mean and how does that apply, then you will begin to get different interpretations. As for someone who has a corrupted view of the world, when it says God is a father, it's not referring to people who have abusive fathers. That is not the model it's trying to portray. And so someone has a corrupted understanding of a term, communication will be difficult in that sense. But just because of disagreement on a passage, but because of disagreement doesn't mean there's no meaning. There are people who disagree that the Holocaust occurred. That doesn't mean that the Holocaust is incomprehensible.
Well, if you go to the book of Hosea and see how the analogy of Hosea as God treated God's wife by throwing her out in the desert and parading her around naked and all these abusive things, you might find that there's maybe other visions of God out there that inform your notion of God. Beyond that, let's take another crack at Jesus wept.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does that mean?
It means he wept.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the meaning of that? Why did Jesus weep?
Well, what does it say? It says you mourn for Jerusalem.
No. The Lazarus incident.
Oh, excuse me. You're right.
So why did Jesus weep?
Weep.
Everybody knows that Bible verse.
Yeah.
But what does it mean?
That you can find passages that have some ambiguity to them doesn't negate my view. Does God exist?
Well, give me an unambiguous passage, please.
In the beginning, God.
Well, that's ambiguous.
Why?
In the beginning of what? You've got two different possible translations, one of which is in when in the beginning God began creating the heavens and the earth, or in the very beginning of everything, we really don't know which is the more appropriate. Grammatically, they're both possible. But you still have the problem of, so the beginning is ambiguous, and so is God.
But God had no beginning. He's eternal.
Nevertheless, to say that that's an unambiguous statement is saying too much.
Well, you could say that about every statement about all communications. My problem here is that everything you say about the Bible can apply to everything we know. And yet we walk through our lives with a concept of understanding and a concept of communications and a concept of being able to interact with one another. And we don't necessarily ask these super deep questions, because ultimately everything goes down to a level of faith. And if that's your point, I would kind of agree with you. But the idea that you even exist on the other end of this communications called the internet, how do I know I'm not talking to a computer simulated hologram out of Caltech Labs or something?
Well,
because I take certain things in faith. I take certain concepts. We all do that. Science does that. Physicists do that. Most of science is built up on these things.
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you with that. But you see, if there are people who would say that the Bible is unambiguous in certain teachings, and therefore, if you don't believe them, you're wrong. And in some cases, we can't even have fellowship.
If you don't believe that Jesus Christ existed, you can't have fellowship with him. I would agree with that.
Well, that's what John said too. but the point is that the notion that some things are so perfectly clear that everybody needs to agree because I see them that way is to misunderstand how people arrive at conclusions about the text. And so my concern in promoting this notion that the Bible is incomprehensible until we make it comprehensible is so that we can live together in such a way that you're entitled to your views, I'm entitled to mine, and we can go about living our lives without having to interfere with each other over belief systems. Because what is really happening is we come into the world as unique individuals who have unique ways of understanding life. And for me to put my understanding over yours, I think is to deny you the dignity of a human being that I want for myself. So I violate the golden rule when I do that. So I'm concerned that too often we find ourselves judging other people because of what we think is plain as day on the scriptures, and the other person has another way of looking at it that is as plain as day to them, and so we cut off communication, which has happened throughout the history of Christianity and is happening today in an amazing amount of occurrences. So is the Bible comprehensible? Yes, to you, but maybe not to me in the same way.
But that's
why on the basic flat text as it lays out there means nothing until we make it mean something.
Well, yeah, but again, you go back the basic arguments of the Holocaust, or the basic arguments is Elvis still alive, or did we go to the moon, or did Oswald shoot Kennedy? All those basic arguments are out there, and they mean something, and some people are right and some people are wrong. But you seem to be conflating actions, because we disagree pretty clearly on this. But I'm not cutting off discussion or.
No, not you.
But see, that has nothing to do with the fact that I believe the Bible says something. It's something different that's cutting. There's something else going on when people cut off communications or start acting in different ways. I think we should judge people at times. Doesn't mean we always judge people on everything. But for example, if you go out and kill somebody, or if you are judging people based on their race, or I think you should be judged for that. And I should say you're wrong. And I believe that from what the Bible teaches. Now, if I'm going to say, well, the story about, the account where everyone's equal, neither slave nor female or male, Greek or Jew or Gentile. Well, that's my interpretation. But if you think it's okay to judge people based on their race, then okay, that's your interpretation. I'm not going to say you're wrong. I will. I know you don't believe that, by the way, and I don't want to give that, but I believe those verses are very clear. And I think the people who in this country before the Civil War and even some afterwards who tried to read racism into the Bible were clearly wrong. And they were wrong to do that. That they did it is a historical fact. That they were wrong to do it, I think, is pretty clear.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. And we certainly do have the right to withdraw our association with certain points of view. But we have to understand that in the doing of that, we are acting upon our point of view, not necessarily the end of the discussion, and to be open to engage in such ways that our points of view are never to cut off anything or anyone, but to remain open to correction and to being able to correct others. I don't see that a lot with people who have very strong opinions. And all you have to do is look on the EDN blogs and see that in action. People are not open to having their views criticized. Some people.
Yeah.
And that's how I think I'm approaching this problem, or trying to eliminate the problem, is to get people to understand that where they are coming from is where they are coming from, and that there's no absolute interpretation of the biblical text that anybody can discern. We can only approach it. And I'd like to throw you out another beautiful example in my mind and see what you think about this. The great confession of Peter. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, in my denomination, that's the entrance, that's the keys to the kingdom. If you believe that, you are accepted as a member of our church. Now, people think that they understand what that means. It should be, on its face, pretty clear. Do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? And you say yes. The problem is that even Peter didn't know what it meant. When Jesus explained it to him, he said, oh no, we're not going to let that happen. You're not going to go to Jerusalem and die. Not on my watch. Get behind me, Satan. So we can use the words. We don't necessarily know what those words mean. And to try to put them into cement, which would then eliminate other points of view, is the beginning of the problem that ultimately ends up in all these warring divisions that we have. So what's your take on that?
Well, again, I would say, do I fully comprehend what it means for someone to be the Messiah, the Son of God? No, I do not fully comprehend that. Do I have some idea what that means? Yes, I have some idea. At some level, that is intelligible. At another level, it's very deep. It's like when you read through John, most of John can be read at multiple levels. And it seems to be, in many cases, almost a as deep as you want to go, John goes even deeper. Um, so there's multiple levels to understanding it. The other point, I go back to what you were saying. I don't see this as a problem of the Bible. I see intolerance and closed-minded and people who break off contact at all kinds of levels. You see that in politics, where a son or daughter goes off and joins another political party, and suddenly there's a big strife within the family because they're no longer the same political party. You see that throughout the history of science, where people who came up with new ideas were routinely shunned and cast out of the scientific community, only later it turns out that they were correct. So you see this whole thing across entire levels of thought. So to say, I guess what I'm fighting against is the idea that incomprehensible and meaning only comes from within us. There is an external truth. We may not have it. And what I would caution people to be humble in the sense that, going back to the question I asked in the first half hour, how many people believe they know everything perfectly 100% correct? Nobody ever answers, 100% that they know. And then you ask them the follow-up question, well, which parts are you wrong on? And why do you still believe them? And of course, they don't know what parts they're wrong on. So there's a bit of humility that goes into this, that it's not a matter of the Bible being unintelligible. When the Bible says that there is a God and that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he came and died for our sins, I think that is completely intelligible at a surface level. If we want to get into details of it, what does exactly God mean, I don't believe God is understandable by us. If you want to say that the Trinity is incomprehensible, at some sense, I would agree with you on that. That is beyond our ability to understand, because it's beyond our ability to even think in that sort of framework. God is bigger than we are. He must, by definition, be something beyond our comprehension.
Well, that's okay, because the Trinity is not a biblical concept anyway.
Well, the term isn't, but I believe the concept is, but that would be a different discussion.
Well, it's the same discussion. Now, the real question is the fact that the Bible is incomprehensible in my mind a problem? And the answer is no, it's not a problem. It's not a problem under the proper understanding, meaning that if we, as you just mentioned, have a humble spirit about the things that we believe, and we work in community, running ideas back and forth with each other, exercising our disagreements, airing them out, hearing back other points of view regarding what we're talking about, then we're absolutely in the right place, we're doing the right thing, and we are learning, we are evolving, we are moving towards a proper understanding, towards a fuller understanding. So for me, this is exactly why the Bible is often a conundrum. It's to challenge us to dig deeper and to do so in relationship to other people doing the same thing, which is part of what a congregation is all about, is to help us do the two things that Jesus said are the most important lessons from the Bible: to learn to love God with all our heart and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So regardless of what you may think about the Bible being incomprehensible, in my mind, that's a good thing. And it brings us closer together and helps us learn to love each other more, because we are less prone to want our own way in that kind of a context.
Well, if that was the case, but that's just not going to happen in many respects. I mean, if I believe we should worship on Saturday and you believe you should worship on Sunday, we're not going to be able to come together on that. And therefore,
Why
it's
not?
hard to be in a community I mean, when community is by definition a set of shared rules and values, and there's certain areas you can allow for tolerance, but then there's certain areas that you can't, and that's where the rub comes in.
We might not be able to come together on a Saturday or a Sunday, but we can certainly come together and we can discuss these things. And
Sure.
part of the reason why there's still this disagreement is because people have hunkered down in their positions and are unwilling to do that.
But if the Bible is unintelligible, how do you reach agreement about what the Bible means if your fundamental position is that it's unintelligible?
Well, because you can't. I mean, that's the evidence of history. The evidence of history is that, as the Pope put it during the Reformation, every man with his Bible soon means every man with his church.
Yeah.
We have become so inured with the notion that I have a right to interpret the Bible the way I want to interpret the Bible. And if I can get enough people to agree with me, then I've got a community. I've got a denomination even.
Sure.
So, the idea that we can live that way is the way we've been living for centuries. We've got to find a way to end that. And I think for me, the beginning point is to understand how I come to understand my points of view, which basically stems from the notion that my lens through which I read the scripture controls my outcome. And it controls your outcome whether you understand it or not. Therefore, if people can finally come to understand that, then we have the opportunity to really learn from each other. Until we can understand that, nothing is going to change.
Well, then how's it that I mean, just in the time that I've been a Christian from the late 70s forward, there's been a massive decrease in division among, Protestants. The denominations are not anywhere near as strong, and people are coming together. Interdenominational movement is fairly strong and growing. Even many denominational church now have removed the denominational label. And what they've done is they've come to agreement on a very large section of belief, basically going back to that, emphasizing the core, where I believe prior to that, what they did is they emphasized the differences. And this is where again, coming up to a disagreement with you, because I believe that the Bible does have a message. And when I look at church history, that core central message, there's much more that Christians have agreed on than they disagreed on. But throughout history, they tend to focus on the points of disagreement and ignored the points of what I consider much larger agreement. And that is a problem. But I don't think you solve it by saying that the Bible is unintelligible.
Are we saved by faith, the Reformation agreement, or are we saved by our works? In some ways, Roman Catholic and other points of view, or are we saved independent of anything we believe or do through election? I mean, that's as basic as you can get. That is at the heart of the faith. And there is serious disagreement about how even that simple thing is accomplished. So my point is that not that those points of view are wrong, it's that we hold them with such tenacity that we can't hear anybody else, and we don't understand why they have that point of view, because we don't understand where points of view come from. And once we understand that, we can move beyond all of this division. And that's what my hope and prayer is. And that's why I wrote my book and why we're having this conversation.
Yeah. And like I said, on your book, I agree. But I don't believe that the Bible is unintelligible.
Until you make it so. You can make it so to your own pleasing, but that's where it ends.
No. And again, this is we're running out of time. In fact, we've run out of time. But I would say you could say everything you're saying about the Bible. You could say about any number of controversies, and fact is, the Holocaust either did or didn't happen. There is a right or wrong view of that, and people that are on the wrong side, i.e., those who deny it, it's not a matter of, well, the evidence is just unintelligible, and we bring our own beliefs into understanding that. It's just same as in history. There's something that actually happened in history. Some people are going to have correct views. Some people are going to have incorrect views. And on some things, we're just not going to know. But I don't believe history is unintelligible. Okay.
Well, I will leave you with the last word.
Okay. Actually, I was about ready to leave you with the last word, but
no, that's fine.
Okay. Well, I think one thing we have demonstrated, and I think we can agree on, is that people can strongly disagree with each other. In fact, unlike a lot of Christians, I think you and I probably disagree more on than we agree. But we do agree on the fact that we should be civil to one another. We should talk to one another, and we should have a bit of humility and tolerance when we engage in our discussions with those who disagree.
Amen, brother.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Henry will be back next week with another Energion Tuesday night hangout, and I will be back on Friday with Global Christian Perspectives, and where we talk about news stories of the week from with Chris Ayers from England and myself from Wisconsin, and sometimes a guest or two. So I hope you can join us for that. And be sure to check out the Energion Discussion Network, of which Steve is the editor, and you'll see lots of disagreements like that going on in a very constructive and intelligent manner. Again, thank you for joining us, and until next week, goodbye.